Hi everyone, and thanks for joining this webinar about inclusive online learning and why it matters. It's great to have you online today. I'm Anna Kelly, the General Manager of Compliance Product here at SAP Litmus, and I'm joined today by Kevin Galvin from Me to Accessibility. Hey Kevin.
Hi, how are you? Good morning everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this presentation.
It's great to have you here, Kevin. Kevin's one of Australia's leading experts in web accessibility with over 15 years hands-on experience. Okay. So first up, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of SAP Litmus. We're bringing you the presentation here today. We're an online training platform with global reach. As well as offering a world-class learning management system, we also have an extensive content library. We offer courses in a wide variety of topics across professional development and compliance. The team based here in Melbourne create content in our Learning Seek compliance library, which is for our Australian and New Zealand customers, and that's the content we've been working on with Kevin, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the webinar. So this section of our library has about 150 courses covering compliance subject matter in everything from employment law to privacy and information security through to consumer and competition law. And our library has a mix of foundation and refresher training, which allows our customers to help mitigate conduct risk, improve culture and behaviour in their organisation while cutting down on training time. I'm going to cross to you now, Kevin, to tell us a little bit more about Me to Accessibility.
Okay guys, so I'm the founder of a company called Me to Accessibility, and we specialize in accessibility, believe it or not. We've been around since about 2016. We specialize in auditing and testing websites, web applications, native apps, e-learning, pretty much anything that any form of digital content. That even expands out to the PDF content and stuff like that. We do quite a bit of user testing as well. So a lot of our clients, such as Coles, for example, not only do they want their products to be technically compliant, but it's great to get real users' feedback. So we will get users with a disability, people with a disability, to use software or websites or e-learning and get their real feedback, get their feedback on how they find it to use it with their tools. We also provide consulting for organizations, and we run several training courses as well in accessibility.
Thanks, Kevin. So I feel like that by having this conversation today, we're joining the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are writing and talking about diversity in the workplace currently. And I'm delighted that so many people also see this as an important topic and have joined us today. And this is what we're going to cover. We'll look at inclusion and why it matters, sort of quite broadly and generally. Then Kev's going to talk about web accessibility, which is a huge part of making inclusive online learning. Then we'll wrap up by covering some other ways to make e-learning more inclusive. Kevin and I will be presenting and talking for about 30 minutes. Please go ahead and share your comments and questions via the chat function, and we'll leave time at the end to answer questions. Okay, so our conversation about inclusive digital learning is really just one small part of a much wider discussion and movement towards creating more diverse and inclusive workplaces. This is such a significant concern for organisations today that over 2/3 of leaders surveyed in Deloitte's Human Capital Trends study see diversity and inclusion as a top priority. And I'm sure lots of you online today are from HR and learning development roles, so it's likely that you're heavily involved in integrating diversity and inclusion in your own organisations. You know, perhaps you're doing things like implementing diverse recruiting practices or rolling out awareness programs like unconscious bias training, all really important pieces of work. So our focus today is very much on inclusion, but it really helps to start by first looking at the relationship between diversity and inclusion. So the definitions I'm using here are from Brandon Hall, and this is an early release of their 2019 Diversity and Inclusion Survey. The full report from them is coming out soon. So on the one hand, the data is showing us that our workplaces and our customer bases are becoming more diverse. And research is also showing that having diversity, be it diversity of thought and background, like culture, ethnicity, age, this is a really good thing in teams and organisations. But simply having a diverse workforce isn't enough. To get the full benefits of this diversity, the differences that people bring to work, they need to be recognised and accepted, and that's where inclusion comes in. So what the evidence is telling us is that people need to be more than just present at work. They also need to feel like they belong. And belonging's a huge and hard to define concept. But Burson by Deloitte have put together this model of inclusion at work, which I think really nicely shows what belonging at work might mean. But what does that mean for online learning?
Okay, so sorry, Anna, you go ahead. I jumped into it.
No worries, no worries. Whether you're creating training for an internal workforce or for your customer base, as I know many organisations that use the SAP Litmus platform are, our learning design needs to take account of greater diversity in our learner group. And learning at work isn't just a sideline activity anymore, it's a fundamental part of how people do their jobs. So the learning that we create has an important role to play in building a sense of inclusion. So making sure that everyone can access your training is a big part of making inclusive online learning. And Kev, it's going to be great to hear you talk about this. So I want to start with asking you a question, and it's one that I've often heard asked, particularly when people are trying to build a big business case for creating accessible content. So people ask questions like, how many people are asking for this feature, or how many people is this going to benefit? So how do you respond to those kinds of questions, Kev?
Yeah, so I'll just skip forward here. And yeah, I think one of the kind of fundamentals to it is the amount of people who in Australia, and this statistic is pretty much is a common statistic across Europe, North America, it's global really, and New Zealand obviously, that 1 in 5 people have a long-term impairment. So I think when people first come to accessibility or start to learn about it, they're often a little taken back by they didn't realize that the figure is quite so big. And out of that 1 in 5 people, 34, so nearly 40% of people with a disability of a working age work as managers or professionals. I think sometimes people have quite a narrow view of accessibility, when in fact it should be kind of a broader view. And as we'd all know, similar to anyone who has an impairment or doesn't have an impairment, the customers are obviously going to be much more loyal. So as customers and staff, it's been proven that customers and staff are much more loyal to organizations that demonstrate diversity and inclusion. If we were to have just a look at the breakdown of those kind of figures, so it's over 4 million people in Australia, if we were to use Australia as the example. So it's 1 in 6 people have a hearing loss. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of numbers that we're talking about. So a lot of people kind of underestimate what they think it is. So 1 in 6 have a hearing loss, and that's a figure that's projected to increase over the next few years to 1 in 4, which is very high. And we'll look on the next screen as to why that is, so you can have a think about it. Another one would be 400,000 people in Australia are either blind or have low vision. And again, that is set to increase in the next 20, 30 years. And one of the largest statistics is 1 in 3 million people have some form of a physical disability. So again, it's a really high number. And these are people, these figures here, the ones that we've just gone through, are ones that are set by the Australian Bureau for Statistics. So they're very hard, concrete figures, but it doesn't include a lot of people who also benefit from accessible design. Now, this group of people, they don't have impairments, but they may have certain conditions. So 10% of the population have dyslexia. Again, that's obviously not a disability, but it is a condition that really benefits from good accessible design. 8% of men are colorblind. So again, obviously it's not a disability, but good design can help people who are colorblind. Other conditions like ADHD and stuff aren't obviously mentioned in here as being a disability. So when you look at it in a broader sense, the figure is actually much more than 1 in 5 when you include a lot of other kind of conditions. The reason that a lot of the numbers are going to go up, so on the previous page we saw that, you know, the number of people with poor eyesight and hearing loss is going to increase, is that in Australia, like most developed world countries, again, New Zealand, Europe, North America, a lot of us have an aging population. So in Australia alone, by 2030, which isn't too far down the road, it's estimated that between 18 and 20% of Australians are going to be over 65. So again, this is another bracket that's not included in that 1 in 5 people in Australia with a disability. But as you get older, you start to have similar traits to people who have a disability. So you have a reduction in eyesight, you have a reduction in color depth perception. So we have all these lovely things to look forward to. Reduction in mobility and dexterity, which would obviously mirror someone with a physical impairment. We all know that your hearing, and unfortunately our memory will get a lot worse, which, you know, kind of mirrors or reflects someone who may have a cognitive impairment. So this is going to be a huge user group, and, you know, there's already great uptake of digital services from the older generation, let's say. But as we all get older, obviously we're going to use these services just like we do now. And it's also important for staff. You know, today people work right up into their 60s, 70s. If the government had their way, would probably be working into our 90s. So, you know, the age that people work is also being pushed up. And, you know, these people are going to be potential staff or customers, and they're going to really, I suppose, benefit from accessible design. So when we're talking about accessible design, a lot of people aren't sure exactly what it is. So we're going to run through that. So in the built environment, people would be much more kind of familiar with the regulations concerning, you know, physical access. So maybe if you're getting a house built or your office built or something like that, you'd all be very familiar with having doors that were wide enough to let a wheelchair access, or to have wheelchair access. And it's something that we can easily comprehend, and we can also very easily see when there's been an issue. So in the right-hand side of the screen there, guys, is a photograph of an accessible entry. Now, you wouldn't have to be an expert in physical design to realize that that's not a very accessible entry, because it's got steps up to the door. So part of the problem in digital accessibility is kind of a skills gap or knowledge gap, that people aren't sure what making digital content accessible, how to do it. And obviously the barriers aren't as easy to identify as they are in the physical environment. In the digital environment, there is a set of guidelines. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they're commonly known as WCAG, which just sounds a bit ridiculous. They're in their second iteration, or 2.1, so is the latest version of them. So some people have sites built to 2.0, which is fine, and some to 2.1, which has just been released recently. These are very much the international benchmark for accessibility. So they're used worldwide. So if you're getting your site made accessible, or if you're asking for something to be accessible, you know, always use these guidelines. They're they're pretty much they're the only guidelines out there. The Americans do use a different set, but they're based on these, and they're very, very similar. And they cover all types of content and resources. So whether you're a designer, whether you're a developer, or a content creator, putting up videos, multimedia, they're inclusive of everything from the very start of a project to how you maintain your website or your e-learning. And they're unfortunately they're a little bit large, so you may have to get some assistance with them. Just a quick slide, just in terms of legislation and accessibility. So most countries are covered by kind of an umbrella UN convention, which is on the rights for people with disability. On a more country basis, Australia has a Disability Discrimination Act, and that was in 1992. Although back then it was just very much the birth of the internet and stuff, so web accessibility wasn't covered, but they've since added it as a note, saying that all private and public websites must comply with the guidelines that we've just seen, and that's in terms of staff. So if it's a company doing e-learning or an intranet, or whether it's customers that are coming to your website. And then the Australian government also has government mandates stating that all of their websites must meet a certain level of compliance. And a lot of other organizations, NGOs, also sign up, and particularly universities, we find, also sign up to those government mandates as well, and they say, yes, we're going to comply with them. So it is covered under legislation, it is covered under, and it's also covered under government mandates. I thought what we'd do to give you an insight into accessibility was we would look at the four main disability groups. So they're broadly divided into people with a vision impairment. So that's whether, you know, if you're blind, you've got low vision, people with a hearing impairment, a physical impairment, which is just huge, that can span, you know, a huge amount of different kind of conditions and impairments, and then cognitive as well. So cognitive is probably the least covered under the guidelines for the level that we're going for, or that the Australian government has set as a level that you need to go for. There's 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. And without bogging you down in lots of detail, what the requirement in Australia and most of the world is for AA. So I thought we would go through this and have a quick look at some of the different, we cherry picked out some of the guidelines that were easy. So some of the guidelines are pretty much from a design perspective, and then some are more technical and from a back-end code perspective. So to make it easy on everyone, we don't want to be looking at tons of code and boring us all to death. I picked out some of the ones that everyone can understand, and they're more of a design. They deal with the design side of things. So a good way to present it is through personas. So this lovely lady here is Emma, and she's very excited to be doing an online course. Emma has a vision impairment, and some of her requirements are that she requires very good color contrast in order to read the text on the website. And she also requires the ability to magnify web pages. Okay, so they would be 2 very common kind of conditions or requirements that someone with low vision would have. So we're going to look at the first example here. So what the guidelines state is, they don't state what colors you can and can't use, but they do state that you have to have a certain level of color contrast, a good level of contrast between the text and the background color. So if we look at the picture on the left-hand side, the screenshot there from the Business Events Australia, and I'm sorry if anyone works for these organizations, I'm not picking on them. I just thought I'd pick real examples. So if you look at the footer links, and this is often a place where there's poor color contrast, just because you're trying to show that they're less important links on the page. So if you look at that, you can see that the sitemap privacy policy is a kind of a gray text on a gray background, and it's difficult enough for the color contrast isn't great and it's difficult to read, but for someone with low vision, that can be if not impossible for them to read that text. So on the right hand side, we have codes. They've got a big tick mark there. They've done it correct. So they similarly have a kind of a grey text, but they've just placed it on a white background or a light grey background, and that provides sufficient colour contrast. So, so sometimes people, there's a misconception about what colours that you are and aren't allowed to use. It's not so much that, it's more the combinations of colours that you are and aren't allowed to use. So that's colour contrast. Another one will be, oops, too far forward, I've shown you the answer. Another one would be things like text on background images. So here we can see on this image, we have text overlaid on the image. Certain aspects of that text might be okay. So where it says web up in the top right-hand corner, we can all read that. But other parts of the image and the text is very difficult to read. So the color contrast is really poor, such as the tagline where it says reliable, simple event marketing software. So, you know, again, elderly people would even, you know, not technically have low vision but just poor eyesight. A lot of people would struggle to read that. And again, the guidelines don't say, oh, you can't use images and you can't have text, but you just have to have color contrast. So the next screenshot is, we go down. The next screenshot is from the ANU, and here we can see a lovely picture of two very enthusiastic students, and they have used text. However, you either put the text on a solid background or even a semi-transparent background, as the case is with this one. So it's got a semi-transparent background, and it makes the text much more legible and readable for everyone. So often accessibility benefits, you know, most people. Again, if you're accessing these on mobile devices, you're outside, there could be environmental factors. You know, color contrast is obviously a good thing to have. Another guideline is around the use of color. So again, color is brilliant. It's really good in terms of having visual cues. It's great from a usability perspective. The guideline just says you can't use it as the only means to convey information. So in the screenshot on the left, the user has failed to put in their email correctly and come back as a red border around the one that they failed to do. So I had a friend, you know, I have a friend in work who's colorblind. He wouldn't be able to distinguish the two boxes. They'd look the same to him. Again, someone who has low vision may have difficulty discerning colors. Someone who's blind wouldn't obviously be able to tell the difference between the red and the green. So on the right-hand side, which is the correct way, again, you can have the red border because it's good practice. But you also would have to, you know, supplement it with some other means. So in this case, we've got an icon and we've got the text to enter a valid email. So again, you can see a lot of times with accessibility, it's about just adding some extra things or changing the way we present or lay out the forms or content. The final one, just under low vision, because I know this pops up quite a bit, is things like graphs and charts. So again, the one on the left-hand side, it uses a color-coded legend. So you have to be able to find the orange and then go over to the right-hand side and look at the donut and see which part relates to which. That even in itself is probably poor from just a general usability because you're constantly kind of looking up and looking down. You know, it's not ideal. On the right, so you can have graphs and charts, absolutely. And in this case, what we've done is we've just simply included labels. So the little label sticks out. So it wouldn't matter if that was in black and white or no matter what color it was in, even if all the bits were nearly the same color, you'd be able to distinguish it. And it's much faster just from a general usability perspective, being able to read that. So again, you can see you can have these features and content on your website. It's more just a case of putting in some considerations around it for accessibility. Okay, so another one, in terms of, I would say about 80, maybe 70, 80% of guidelines are for vision impairment, whether it's low vision or blindness, largely because the web and digital content is a visual medium. The second persona, he's not a persona, this is Mark, he's actually my good friend, and he went blind in university. And digital content is much more accessible to him. Obviously, content in hard copy, he just cannot read, and he can't read Braille. So having it in digital content, it means that he has a piece of software. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, called a screen reader, and it will announce everything that's on the page to him. It'll read all the text. So he can, before, just to give you a little example, if you were blind, and you wanted even to do something quite simple like read a newspaper, you'd have to get a friend to read it to you, or you could get it on tape 3 days later. So that wasn't exactly breaking news if it was 3 days out. And now you can go and do your shopping online without having to leave your house. Obviously, if you were blind, and you'd have to get someone to bring you around the shops. So digital content being accessible really is empowering, and it's great. One common issue that we would come across, and people might be familiar with this, is that obviously the screen reader can't read images because it's just an image. It has to have a description, okay? So on this case, And what it is, it's called alt text. People are probably familiar with that. And the alt text should describe the image, and that will get read out to a screen reader. It also is used by Google to index your site, because Google, it probably will be in the future, but right now it can't read your images either. So in this case, the black image, a day in the life creative workshops. Again, this is a real example. The alt text reads 600 e-footer, 1200 by 250. So Mark won't have any idea what that image means, unfortunately. So he'd either have to get someone to help him, or he'd have to delve into the article or the upcoming event to try to figure it out, which is just frustrating. Another example, again, a similar one, would be where there's no alt text. So in this instance, the image where it says Helpman Awards presented live in Sydney, that is just left totally blank. So if Mark was accessing this with a screen reader, it would just announce nothing. And what makes it doubly worse is that the text underneath, it doesn't actually include the information that's in the image. So Mark would have no idea what the big night at the Australian Theatre was. And to get it again, he'd have to go in, delve into the article itself and try to figure out what it was. And again, that adds time, frustration, and is a common issue that we would come across. Okay, so the next one would be someone with a physical impairment. In this case, we've picked Simon, who has developed arthritis in later life, but it hasn't slowed him down. One of the things that is common is that lots of people with a physical impairment don't use a mouse, simply because they can't grip the mouse properly. So a lot of people may use different kinds of hardware. Some will use keyboards like this adaptive keyboard here that we see, the round one. So it's critical that everyone, anytime you've built a website or a form or anything, that you can use it just with your keyboard. And one of the areas that we come up with issues, or commonly we spot problems, is in and around little things like widgets. So in this form, you're asking for your first name, last name, and your date of birth. And when you go into the date of birth, a little widget opens up with a calendar. Now, a lot of these calendars, you can only use them with a mouse. You can't use them with a keyboard. It's a very common issue. So there's two solutions there. One is that you make the widget keyboard accessible, or like we've looked at already, you simply allow the user to enter their date of birth manually with their keyboard. So instead of using the widget, they can just type in 18th of the 8th, 1975. They don't even have to interact with the widget. So as long as there's an accessible alternative, you can opt in. Oops, sorry guys, that was my alarm telling me that I have to hurry up. Okay, so I have to hurry up. Okay, so yeah, so again, another thing with when it comes to is that people who are blind don't use a mouse either. So there's a lot of overlap there, because they can't obviously see where the cursor is. So they just use a keyboard. So having something useful, having your site usable just with a keyboard is critical, and it is a test everyone can do at home. You just use your tab keys, your arrow keys, your return key. Okay, so we're looking at hearing now. So this is Matt. Matt's hard of hearing. As we all know, a lot of e-learning includes multimedia content like video and audio, which is great. So sometimes with the video and audio, we do require, there are again some considerations. So the most obvious one and the biggest one is to include captions. So most people are familiar with captions. You see them on YouTube. They appear at the bottom of the screen like the subtitles. The only difference is that with subtitles, they just include dialogue because they assume you can't speak the language, French or Spanish. So captions also have to include other important audio. So if there was a dog barking and that was important, or a song in the background that was particularly important to the video, you'd have to include that as well. And again, there's overlap, because not only do people who are deaf or hard of hearing benefit hugely from captions, people also might be in a quiet or noisy environment, or they mightn't have their headphones, such as you're in the gym or at the airport. So captioning content is very important. And again, Google uses the captions. That's one of the reasons they have them, so that they can index your content. Okay, the last one I'm going to go through is Liam. So this, Liam falls under the kind of cognitive impairment. Again, being dyslexic isn't obviously a disability in itself. But Liam, and this is also for other people who have ADHD, English mightn't be their first language and they may be concentrating quite a lot on reading, gets distracted very easily by things like moving content on the screen or auto-updating content, or, God forbid, sites that play audio automatically, which just distracts everybody. So similar to the other examples we've seen, you can have moving content, you can have auto-updating content, and you can, if you wanted to, have music. You just have to allow the user to be able to pause and stop them. So this is I'm just going to myself if that's a slider or a carousel. I think it's a carousel. And so you can have them. If this one was auto playing, so you arrive on the site and it's automatically going through the images and stuff, you have to allow the user to be able to pause it. So you have to have a pause button. Similarly with a video, if it's a video, you can have a video on a page, that's no problem obviously, but you have to have a pause button. So if the user press play, they can stop it. So as you can see through most of them, you're allowed to have these features. You just have to have some additional built-in considerations, such as being able to pause it or etc., that will make it accessible. So a lot of people don't like moving content, whether you're have an impairment or not. So giving them these options to be able to turn on and off moving content, flickering content, and audio really does benefit everybody. I am just now going to hand you back to Anna. I think I went 2 minutes over, so I apologise for that. But Anna.
Thank you, Kevin. It's just, I think, so important to get that overview of who benefits from web accessibility. It's a much broader group than people realise, and actually just having those practical tips there. I think a lot of people think web accessibility is this highly technical area, which it can be, but there are also things that anyone who's designing e-learning can be doing in their everyday practice. And here at SAP Litmus, we've been working with Kevin on making our content, our e-learning accessible. We started by making one of our foundation suites accessible and also one of our refresher suites. So I want to show you a before and after, love a before and after shot of one of these projects. So this is our adaptive suite. On the left, you've got a screenshot of what a course from the adaptive suite looked like before it was accessible. And on the right, we've got the AA accessible version. And really what we're showing here is there is so little difference between the two, and we really didn't have to compromise on design at all. So all of the new content that we're now releasing for Australia and New Zealand is AA accessible. But look, I'd be the first to admit that this is not something that we achieved overnight. So we've worked really closely with Kev, and I would encourage anyone who's thinking of going down this path to work with an accessibility consultant like Me2 Accessibility. It was a really great learning experience for the team. We also access some external training. Feel free to contact me directly if you want to chat about the kind of training that we did. And as well as building our technical skills, I think we went through this process of changing hearts and minds, because a lot of us thought initially that if we built accessible content, we would have to compromise on design and interactivity, but we haven't, which is great. So we're going to actually share a little giveaway with those of you who have joined us today, because here in the team, we've collated a lot of our learning into a really simple introduction to digital accessibility, specifically for e-learning. It's a course that's now in our library, and we'll email a link to that course to you after the webinar. So check out that email when it comes through and take a look at how you can make accessible digital content. Okay, so web accessibility is a large part of inclusive online training, but there are other things to consider too. Technology is a big part. So Kevin spoke about several aspects of technology. So a feature of having more diverse and dispersed workforces and learner groups is that not everyone is accessing their training in a physical office or from a desk. And with the rise of flexible work arrangements like part-time and working from home, people need to be able to learn anytime and on any device. And if you're rolling out training to customers, they could literally be accessing that from anywhere. So mobile devices are really fast becoming a critical tool for how people do their jobs, and mobile learning is being adopted more and more by organisations. So what this really means for us, those of us who are producing online training, we've got to be inclusive of all technologies. So our online learning must be responsive, and it's got to work just as well on desktop as on mobile devices. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is whether inclusive learning design is really all that different from just good old-fashioned learning design and what most instructional designers are doing already. For example, anyone who creates training, I'm sure many of you listening do, what's the first thing we ask? We always ask who our audience is and who our learners are. So if your learner group is more diverse, surely by asking that question, like, is it enough? And I guess I'm going to say that not always, because often when we think of our audience, we think of them only as learners. So we ask questions like, what do they know already? What do they need to know? What are their knowledge gaps? And these are all great and really important questions. They're the fundamentals of good learning design. But great learning design thinks about the audience, not just as learners, but as people, and asks a few more questions as well. So what's the gender mix? What's the age range? What sort of background do these people have? And it's also worth thinking about who might be underrepresented in the group or who might get left out. And these questions are important because as learning designers, we have unconscious bias too. And by this, I mean that, like, for all of us, our brain is making these involuntary shortcuts based on stereotypes. And the thing about unconscious bias is we all have it. And the best way to tackle it is just to acknowledge that and just be a little bit more conscious in our decision making. So let's look at 4 ways we can tackle unconscious bias when we're designing training, and how we can make training where whoever's accessing it kind of sees themselves in the learning. So photos and imagery, this is, as learning designers, we use photos a lot to convey meaning, but we need to be conscious and mindful that, like, say when we're selecting from stock image libraries, that we avoid stereotypes. So scenarios and names is another consideration. As learning designers, we also like to use stories to make content relevant and more meaningful. So stories are set in places and they involve people. So we need to be conscious of where your stories happen and who's in them. We had an example of this in our own work recently where we started creating more content for New Zealand. So we took advice on including Maori characters in scenarios, and we looked at who are the large migrant populations in New Zealand and made sure these people were reflected in the training. Language is also important. I mean, this is really basic learning design. We need to think about people who speak English as an additional language or who have low literacy levels. So it's always a great idea to check your text, whether it's written or audio, against readability levels. And there's tools in Word to do this. And also try avoiding using colloquial language that might not make sense to everyone. And the last thing, the last tip I'd like to talk through relates to humour. I don't know about you, but more and more I see learning design using humour, and personally I think it's a wonderful thing. Done well, it's also a really effective strategy because laughing makes you feel good and feeling good improves your learning. But at the same time, it's important to be mindful that humour can land really differently for people of different ages or in different countries. So particularly if you're making global content, as we are, when you're using humour, it's important that we keep everyone in the room, because not getting the joke can really make you feel left out. So that brings us to the end of the main part of our presentation this morning. We have certainly some time to take your questions. We've had a couple come through, but I'll just give you some time. If you do have questions, use the question function there and type them in. So we've got one here from Daniel, I think it is. Kev, this one looks like it's one for you. He's asked whether digital accessibility includes mobile phones.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And yeah, it absolutely does. Everyone's mobile phone, whether it's an iPhone or an Android-based phone, or for those few who have Windows phones, they all have built-in accessibility in them. So whether it's being able to increase the text size, or being able to zoom in, so you can use pinch and zoom, or even change the background colors on a page, so you can change out and you can use a high contrast version. So they're actually really good tools in terms of accessibility, but they also, all of them have a built-in screen reader. So they have the ability, so if you're blind, you can use them and they will read out everything that's on the page to you. And in fact, I have a lady or a colleague I used to work with in Australia, and I still get her involved in user testing, and she doesn't really use a desktop computer at all. I mean, the screen, the monitor is largely, she doesn't use it anyway. So she just uses her iPhone, and then she attaches a Bluetooth keyboard to it. So whenever I do user testing with her, she just has her phone and then she just types into the keyboard and the screen reader reads everything back to her. So yeah, so it is important that your content is accessible on both desktop devices and on mobile devices, and which kind of plays into what you were just talking about there a few slides ago, and just about different, accessing content. It's not always going to be sitting at your office. You can accessing your content lots of different places, people working from home, on mobile devices. So it's exactly the same for people with a disability. They're going to be accessing content in the same manner. Yeah, so good question. It's very important. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you. We've had another question come in from Charlotte. What's the best screen reader to check the alt text is correct in e-learning?
Yeah, so you don't actually need a screen reader to check the alt text. There's lots of tools that you can use. You can either write, you can just view the source of the page. There's lots of testing tools out there that will show you the alt text. Or you can use screen readers as well. There's a few of them. In Australia, the main screen readers that people use are one called JAWS, just like the shark. That is a paid one, so you have to buy that, and it is can be a bit expensive. But there is another one called NVDA, which is non-visual desktop access, which is a bit of a mouthful of an acronym. And that is actually developed by two blind Australian developers up in Queensland. And that is a really good screen reader, and it's totally free. So you can download it and you can test your websites with it. It's totally free. Takes a little bit of getting used to. But if I was doing any testing, I would use NVDA because, and if I was testing on a screen reader, because it is free and it's a very good screen reader. But yeah, like I was saying, you don't need to. You can just test the alt text without actually using a screen reader. There's lots of tools. There's one called WebAIM by a company called Wave, and there's a huge amount. If you want, you can contact me afterwards, or I can send you a list of them. But yeah, good question.
Thank you. And we've got, it's sort of more of a comment than a question from Miriam saying that they use personas to inform courses and describe people from different backgrounds. And that's, I think that's actually a really important point. So I talked there about, a couple of ways that we can challenge our unconscious bias, but if we actually develop these personas and as Miriam suggests, and not just describe, you know, the person's job, but actually their background, then of course we'll design learning for them as well. So thank you for that. And a couple of people are just asking for the list of screen readers, so we can, yep, definitely include that in our email. So thank you so much for joining us here today to talk about this really important topic. Kev, thanks for joining us and sharing that great introduction to web accessibility as well.
Yeah, anytime.
Thank you. It's been fantastic to have so many people on the line for the topic this morning. Look out for that email that we'll send through shortly. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy your Thursday. Thanks.
Bye now.